Hello, I'm Jim Slusher, a representative of the Daily Herald editorial board. Today is Tuesday, September 22nd, and we're pleased to begin an interview with candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives from the Illinois 6th District. We're joined by members of the Daily Herald editorial board, myself, Jim Slusher, Peter Nanny, John Lampinen, Jim Bauman, Diane Dungy, Lisa Miner, Daily Herald CEO Scott Stone, our reporter Russell Lissow, and a member of the editorial board for Shaw Newspapers, John Stife. I'd like to emphasize that as a reporter, one person, Russell Lissow, is here not to make a judgment, but just to cover the race. He doesn't have any influence into what the Daily Herald editorial board may decide regarding the endorsement. And with us today is Democrat Sean Casten, the incumbent. His Republican challenger, Jeannie Ives, is declined to participate. So, Congressman, let's start by asking you to take just a couple of minutes to describe what motivated you to run for a second term, what you'd like to accomplish in the next
one. When I ran for the first term, I was motivated by the same thing I'm motivated by in the second term. I've dedicated my whole life to climate change. That was true working as a scientist. It was true working as an entrepreneur. And I think if you're really lucky in this life, you know what you want to accomplish by the time you're done with it, but the tools evolve along the way. And when we'd sold our company and Donald Trump was elected, I realized that I had a great fear about what would happen in a government that politicized science and the opportunity to make a difference. So joined, obviously won the race last time. The Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that I served on has produced a report that's been called the most serious and sophisticated effort by Congress ever to deal with climate change. And I want to finish the work. We got to get it signed into law. Now, along with that, we're in the middle of a health crisis. We're in the middle of an economic meltdown, and it has become keenly aware to me that this is a job that has such power and such responsibility. And if you are not an intellectually curious person open to all ideas, it's a really dangerous job. And I've enjoyed it, look forward to keeping it, but there's a lot of work left to be done.
Okay, thank you. First question, I'd like to start immediately with the rap video. I know you've been asked a lot about this lately, but I'd like to hear from you directly on a couple of points. Namely, how does your characterization of people in the video differ from A, the comments that Hillary Clinton made about the deplorables who support Donald Trump, or B, the characterizations that your opponent, Jeannie Ives, made when she was a candidate for governor in a controversial ad about people who she didn't agree with. How is your point of view on the rap different? Respond to that.
Look, I don't apologize for liking music. I don't apologize for being in a band. I don't apologize for not liking racists and standing up to them. We know that we have a president who is sitting there saying there's very fine people on both sides. We know that we have a president who has actively animated white nationalism. Why are we afraid to talk about it? We're sitting here with this massive mobilization, the largest peaceful protest in our nation's history for Black Lives Matter. And we have one political party, and I would submit to you the majority of the country, that's celebrating that as this amazing moment. As John Lewis told us before he died, he's never been more inspired because his whole life, he's never seen such diversity of people standing up for equality. And yet, I have colleagues across the aisle who are saying, you know what, this is about looting and violence. We know what that's code for. And I don't apologize for standing up to bigots. Now, you know what I said in the video, I never said that Trump voters were racists, but I said, what do you do when you don't stand up to your base and your base is racist? That's not leadership, that's cowardice. And I don't apologize for calling it out.
Okay, so would you describe people who disagree with you on some of these issues and may support your opponent or support the president as racists and loonies?
I never said that. I said, what do you do if your base denies science? What do you do if your base is racist? What do you do on any number of issues? You know, we get elected into this job because we tell people we are capable of leadership. And then you have an awful lot of people in this line of work who say, well, I can't really push hard on that issue because my base won't support me. Well, that ain't leadership. So, you know, I think the beauty of this job is you have an ability to shape public opinion in a meaningful way. I take a lot of pride in the fact that climate change shows up as being a top 3 issue when we poll people in this district. That wasn't true before I started running. It's because we were out there talking about it. I take a lot of pride in the fact that Black Lives Matter is hugely popular in this district, and I'd like to believe that that has something to do with the fact that I've been out there speaking publicly about it, being available, going to marches. You can shape public opinion. People's opinions change over time. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can't sit there and double down on it and then be afraid of those opinions, especially given our nation's history, and call yourself a leader.
Okay, let's move on to some other issues. First, not that far from where we are now, do you see this election as a referendum on Donald Trump and his presidency, and to what extent is that relevant to the 6th district?
Yes and no. I think there is one narrative of recent history that has a fairly close view in the rearview mirror that says this is a referendum on Trump. But I think there's a somewhat longer time horizon that says the majority of the country voted for Hillary. The majority of the country was repulsed by the misogyny at the heart of Trump's campaign, being credibly accused of rape, all the things that we know happened that came out of Trump's mouth. And their response to that was the Women's March. Their response to that was the March for Science. Their response to that was all the kids like my daughters who marched for our lives after Parkland, and all this huge rise in civic action. The huge number of people who ran for office for the first time, being a part of the most diverse Congress in history as a result of that. Not just racially diverse and gender diverse and sexual orientation diverse, but a Congress that I think has more people who have never held or sought elected office than ever before in history. Not that they haven't done interesting things, but I think a huge number of people saw Trump and said, it's time for me to become civically engaged. And I think that speaks to the character of the country. And it's a weird silver lining to come from Trump, but I think it's a reminder of who we are and the fundamental decency of who we are, more than just a reaction to Trump.
Okay. Recently, the president tweeted something having to do with the suburbs, and said the suburbs were in trouble if affordable housing issues were taken up and changes were made related to affordable housing. I wonder if you should discuss a little bit whether you see affordable housing regulations, what kinds of changes you think should be made, and do you see housing policy or any policies threatening the quality of life in the suburbs?
Look, let's be honest. This is sort of like traveling back to the 60s racist dog whistles, right? We know that. I grew up in a town in Westchester County in New York. The school I went to was one of the first schools to mandate busing. And as a result of that led to waves of white flight in the 70s. My elementary school had 300 people and it was majority white. By the time I graduated, there were 150 people in my class and it was majority African American. So wonderfully diverse experience. But that was the legacy of redlining, and white flight through the 70s. And I don't think you can look at our history and not acknowledge that legacy has fundamentally shaped how populations are distributed throughout the country, how access to opportunity is distributed throughout the country. Raj Chetty has done fascinating work looking at how the single best predictor of your wealth mobility and income mobility over the course of your life is where you were born. being fortunate enough to be born and grow up in the suburbs like we are means that you've got better schools, better housing, safer communities, and all that goes with that. And I think if we're going to live up to our foundational promise that everybody has the equal opportunity for a great life, then we've got to have a conversation about how do we make sure that your access to those schools, your access to those communities, your access to those safe neighborhoods isn't a function of the random roll of the dice that says where your parents happened to be living when you were born. And that's a conversation that I think in any sort of moral and ethical way is going to have an element of affordable housing to it. And that's appropriate. That's not anything to be scared about. I think it's something to welcome. But I don't see it as I think it's deeply mean and amoral to frame that as something that's going to risk violence. I love the fact that my high school was so diverse. It gave me a diversity of experiences I never would have had. I never felt unsafe. Would that we all had those opportunities.
Yeah. I'd like to move to some of the troubles that we've seen across the country since the death of George Floyd. You mentioned it earlier that looting and rioting, those complaints were a sign of dog whistles for something else. I guess I'd like to know what is your stance on the protests and on looting and rioting specifically? Did you not see any things that gave you any concerns?
Well, look, to state the obvious that shouldn't need to be said, but should be said, don't loot, don't riot. Peaceful protest is amazingly powerful, and absolutely condemn those who would corrupt those. At the same time, I think as a human being, if you saw one of your loved ones being choked to death by Derek Chauvin and felt like the police who are here to protect me are the ones doing the choking, I think we can at least empathize with why you might feel like those people who are obligated to protect you, if you don't feel like they're your friends and your allies, I think we can sympathize with how that might create a certain feeling of hopelessness. And we've got to deal with the root causes of that hopelessness, right? That really shouldn't be partisan. You know, we've had police violence with a predominant focus on Black and brown communities for a long period of time, arguably going back to Reconstruction, right? When you march in those Black Lives Matter, and they cheer, say their names. It's not just George Taylor or George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, right? It's Amadou Diallo, it's Laquan McDonald, people going back. It's Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, going all the way back to Emmett Till. So we know that we have that history that we have to confront. I think we can acknowledge that as long as we have law enforcement, which we must, we have to also acknowledge that giving people the authority to use coercive deadly force in the streets requires really tight accountability and oversight. And I think there's always going to be a tension where we need the Attorney General's office, when they see excesses, to step in, to execute consent decrees, to figure out, is there a management problem? Is there a structural problem? How do we grapple with the fact that we don't call the police to solve crimes, we call the police to solve problems that nobody else knows how to solve. And so, our police force gets called in with deadly force, often to solve mental health issues, to solve behavioral health issues. Do they have the training for that? Do they have the resources for that? That's an appropriate conversation to have. And like I said, I think we can empathize with people who feel hopeless when they feel like that their lives are at risk from the people who protect them. But that doesn't mean we don't condemn violence.
Do you think then that some of these issues that occur in police departments and so forth, do you think they're systemic, and what role do you think the federal government has in addressing these issues? Are they a federal issue, or are they something that states and localities should be focusing on more?
And sorry, are you referring to police violence, or are you referring to?
Yeah, I guess primarily police violence, but if there are issues, social justice issues that go beyond police, those as well.
I don't think there's any question but that they're systemic. When I was down in Selma with John Lewis before he died, and just this beautiful trip, Brian Stevenson was with us, author of Just Mercy, and he said it in his book, he said it in the movie. I'm not saying anything that you all haven't heard, but somehow it's, hearing him say it in person and touring the museum he built with us, where he said, our original sin wasn't slavery. Our original sin was the narrative of inequality, because you can't take people into bondage. You can't abuse them. You can't, take their wives as your lovers and then abuse their kids that come out of those unions, unless you first convince yourself that they are somehow inferior to you, because how would you sleep at night? And, and what Stevenson pointed out was that we ended slavery, but we never really got through that narrative of inequality, because that same narrative allowed us to sustain Jim Crow. The same narrative now allows us to massively over-incarcerate Black men. The same narrative allows us to drive through, look at how when the crack cocaine epidemic came up, we talked about welfare queens and people who don't want to work. And when the opioid epidemic came up in Appalachia, we said, this is really a behavioral health problem, and we need to empathize with these people in difficult situations. We should empathize, that's right. But why did we treat those two populations differently? And I think Brian Stevenson is right. We've never really had that conversation as a country. And if you've grown up with that thought in your head, some of us go on to be politicians and still have those thoughts in our head. Some of us go on to be newspaper writers and still have those thoughts in our head. Some of us go on to be police officers and still have those thoughts in our head. And we need to have the conversation, because until we have the conversation, we can't address it. And until we address it, we can't deny that we still live in a country with systemic racism and all of the problems that raises.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about gun control and what is the federal role in whatever gun control you think we should have? And is there something that can be done in the next term on that issue?
So the amazing thing about gun control is that there is amazing popular support for everything that we should do. And the NRA has corrupted the debate where the will of the majority of the people is not expressed in what we can get done on the House floor. We should absolutely have an assault weapons ban. You can't make an argument why you need an assault weapon for self-defense. We should absolutely have universal background checks. We should close the Charleston loophole. Now, we've done all this stuff in the House this term. We should have, I'd love us to pass the Gun Trafficker Detection Act that I introduced this term, which just recognizes that, particularly in the Chicago area, when so many of the crimes are done with guns that are brought in from out of state and not by the person who bought the gun, we don't have a background check problem. We have a gun trafficking problem. And so why don't we just say to gun owners that we're gonna ask you to have the same responsibility that car owners have. You have to keep it locked, and if somebody takes out and then there's damage done to it, you as the owner and the holder of the insurance on that will be responsible for it. So we've introduced that act to do that. But even if we did all of that, what we need to talk about, and I would submit to you that we're not talking about yet, is that we have too many guns. We have more guns than cars in this country. We have more guns than people in this country. And the number 2 country in per capita gun ownership is Serbia. The number 3 is Yemen. To get to the level of Serbia, we would have to take away about 110 million guns. To get to the level of Yemen, closer to 170 million guns. I don't think anybody would argue that the average Yemeni's access to firearms is in any way limited. Right? And yet we have more than twice as many guns per capita as they have there. And if we passed all the greatest laws in the world, the guns are still out there. And the heck of it is we've seen countries that have done, after the Port Arthur shooting in Australia did a gun buyback program. They took a whole bunch of guns out of circulation, and they haven't had a mass shooting since. Why don't we do that?
Okay.
So
New direction. I'm sorry, go ahead.
you just jump in here and ask. So how would you go about doing that, Congressman? I mean, if we want to reduce the guns that are out on the street, how would you?
Well, let's use best practices. What Australia did was recognize that this was going to be extremely difficult. When you have a highly armed population, it's hard to go take them away in a safe way. And so what Australia did was said, we're going to do a gun buyback program, and we're going to give people the opportunity to come and sell their guns. They'll get a windfall amount of money, and that proved to be successful. Would it work exactly the same way and adapted to US culture? I don't know. I'll leave to smarter people to figure that out. But my interest right now is less about how to do that particular policy to get it done, as much as let's start having the conversation to acknowledge it, because that so far has really been, nobody's really felt comfortable having that conversation. And yet, if you don't have that, how much impact do these other measures really have? The significant majority of all the gun deaths every year in this country are by suicide. And yet we have a conversation of guns don't kill people, people don't kill people. How mean-spirited is that? If you've got a loved one who's killed themselves and you're going to blame it on them, right? We don't have a higher rate of suicide attempts in this country. We're just much better at it because we have access to deadly force. We're not going to fix that with background checks or assault weapons bans. We will fix that by finding a way. I'm open to all ideas, but let's find a way to have fewer guns.
Okay, a little bit different direction, but the issue that really is sort of laying over the country entirely right now, and for how long we don't know. How would you rate the United States response to the COVID crisis so far? And what do you think are the roles that the federal government should have compared to the roles that the state governments should have in addressing it?
Look, when we're 4% of the world's population and a fifth of the world's deaths, when lots of countries that are higher than us on deaths have already bent the curve and come down, nobody can honestly look at what we've done and said we've done a good job. We should be ashamed of the job we've done. Those countries that have done a good job, none of them have had access to vaccines because a vaccine doesn't exist. What they did from a very early on, every country that used the WHO's tests had tests in place and was ramping up mass testing earlier. We weren't suppressing access to tests, as some would argue we may still be doing today. Once they had those tests in place, they put huge contact tracing programs in place at the whole of government level, not at a state by state level, because yes, states should support the federal government, but we can't stop people from driving over to Michigan for the weekend. You've got to do contact tracing throughout the whole system, kids going to school, what have you. The third thing that countries like South Korea, I think, did very effectively is and actually what the University of Illinois right now is doing very effectively, is that if you test positive, we make sure that you can quarantine in a way that doesn't risk your job or the safety of your family, or your ability to have housing, right? So providing essentially quarantine housing to folks so that you can get to a point where you're not contagious anymore, hopefully survive the ordeal, but isolate and lock down. University of Illinois is now doing that with their SHIELD program. And if you look at what's happening on the U of I campuses, they've largely solved COVID by following those models. We should have been doing that nationwide. And my goodness, elevate the scientists. The fact that we are still arguing about whether it's political to wear a mask, how many people are dying because they think it's a political opinion to do what's scientifically necessary, right? Other countries didn't do that because they put the scientists forward, not the politicians. We put the politicians forward and politicized the science. And there's, I was out on the mall today putting, a handful of the flags to recognize that we just hit 200,000 dead. And you sit there and say, 4%, 20% of the world's deaths. What does that mean? 80% of these deaths didn't have to happen, if we were just average, 80% of those people would still be alive today. I'd like to believe we're exceptional, but on this one, we're exceptional the wrong way.
You talked about giving more respect to scientists. I have this question. Scientists don't have to, they're not accountable to voters. They don't have to get reelected. They don't have to be responsible for the economy. They don't have to be responsible for whether we go to war, for so many other things. Is there a danger if we go in the direction that you're talking about, that we can go too far, that scientists can be given too much sway?
Not on scientific issues, right? I mean, science is not democratic.
Right. But at some point, you got a balance between the science and the economy.
Well, but where that's a political question, right? I mean, the question of what is the best way to stop the spread of infectious disease? That is a scientific question. Will we be able to spend the money? How will we fund that? Those are political questions, right? We can hire scientists down at Fermilab to tell us all sorts of amazing things about the fundamental properties of our universe, but we shouldn't ask the scientists to say, should we fund a super collider expansion, right? They can make the pitch and we can decide. That's a political question. The problem is when we start politicizing those scientific questions. I mean, look at how far we have been set back on climate change because we politicized this, and we had people who basically lied to further their political ends about something that is unambiguously scientifically true. It's not fundamentally different from saying this will all magically go away. Lied to further political ends, and we are paying the price as a society for that.
Okay, are there others on the board, or John, you have other questions for the Congressman? If not, Congressman, thank you very much. I'd like to give you at least a couple minutes to tell voters why they should vote for you.
Well, thank you all for doing this. I guess I'd close with what I said at the start, that I am in certain ways very optimistic about where we are as a country, as painful as this moment is. And, none of us went into this. I certainly didn't expect to be in the middle of a pandemic, much less have impeached a president, much less being sworn in the wake of the longest shutdown in our government's history. But I think at the same time, what I find so encouraging is that when you ask people about issues, not about who are you going to vote for, not about do you agree that politician X thinks this about the issue, but when you ask them on the core issues, do you think we should do something about climate change? Do you think all the questions we just talked about, do you think Black lives really do matter? There's overwhelming unanimity of perspective in this country. Do you think everybody should have access to healthcare? And I think that if we step back from that, and when you go out and you talk to people, as I have in my 40 town halls or go and march with people, what you find is that we actually have an awful lot of common shared values that are consistent with the values that we've never been perfect, but they are consistent with the values that we think of as the better angels of being an American. And I think this huge surge in civic awareness is a reminder of those values, that we will get past this. I am massively humbled at having the opportunity to try to represent those values in Congress in my first term. And I look forward to continuing that in the 117th session.
Hey, Congressman, this is John Lampton, the editor with the Daily Herald. I got one other question for you, if I may. Yep. These issues that seem to concern you the most, climate change, gun control, systemic racism. Do you think that it's going to be harder to tackle those with what seems like there's going to be an inevitably more conservative court and frankly more conservative judges throughout the country?
It's a scary question, isn't it? I mean, I'd put the question a different way. And frankly, I'd add healthcare to your mix of questions. Healthcare is probably the most important one, because the efforts that the Trump administration has gone through to break the ACA, that will be before the court in November. And I think the question that all of us are grappling with, not just elected officials, but all of us as Americans, is when you have these values that are shared by the overwhelming majority of the American people, and we have institutions in our government that do not reflect the will of the majority of the American people, what happens to a democracy? And if that question doesn't scare you, I don't think you understand the question, right? If the Supreme Court were to be reconstituted and strike down the ACA and take 20 million people off their health insurance, an extremely popular program, at what point do masses of people start to question the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself? I'm not advocating for that. I'm not trying to, but I'm saying we need to be thinking about those sorts of questions. I think one of the things that scared me most about the Kavanaugh hearings was that everybody knows he lied under oath to the Senate, and everybody knows he got confirmed anyway. What does that do when he cast the deciding vote? And what does that do? It's as the question you said, Jim, about, how do we empathize with people in the street who feel hopeless when they don't feel the police are protecting them? What do we do if significant majorities of the American people don't believe that the court is implementing their values? If I was John Roberts, I would be deeply concerned about that question, because that's how you start to break the institutions. I don't want the institutions to break, but I wish it wasn't partisan to insist on maintaining the integrity of the institutions in the first instance.
Okay, well, this concludes our interview. I want to thank Congressman Casten for his time and for his participation. Remind people that Election Day is November 3rd, but you can vote as early as probably this Thursday or Friday, because mail-in ballots will go out on Thursday, the 24th. And please remember that voting is one of the most sacred obligations we have in our democracy, maintaining our democracy. We hope you'll use the Daily Herald and dailyherald.com and Shaw Media as you make your decisions about who to elect. Please look at a variety of sources. Meanwhile, thank you very much for your time.